That was it. The text then goes into another stage, we call it the final stage. That is, from the consolidated version, I, the regional coordinator, have the last chance to work with the text and on the text, which means especially make it shorter. For example, Tunisia, the problem is Tunisia in this first draft was 31,000 words. We have a range around 12,000 words, which means we accept everything between 8,000 and 16,000. But you can see 31,000 words was double as we...
To introduce the opening speech given by visiting Professor Dr. Jan Claudius Völkel, who is a visiting professor at the University of Cairo, American University of Cairo. His main research focuses on the modern Middle East as well as the European Union and the United Nations. Since 2008, Jan has been serving as the regional coordinator related to North Africa and the Middle East for the Bertelsmann Transformation Index. He has been lecturing on he has been lecturing in northern Iraq and the US as well. From 1996 to 2002, he studied political science, economics, and Oriental studies in Freiburg, Basel, and Cairo, and published his PhD thesis on the image of the United Nations in leading Arab newspapers. It was published in 2008. Given the theme of the conference, we thought it could be interesting to have a presentation by a person from one of the think tanks dealing with measuring what is going on here and there. And for instance, of course, of relevance for this conference, right now in the Middle East, is it possible, is it meaningful to measure what is going on and to insist that it is a transformation process? And I'm sure that this lecture by Jan will shed some light on this issue. We thought it was the real place, the relevant place to start. And therefore, it is my pleasure to welcome you to speak here. Please, Jan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Peter, for the kind words of introduction. It's my greatest pleasure to be here among you, distinguished students, PhD candidates, but also, of course, professors, organizers, participants of this conference, and the distinguished guests from embassies of Kazakhstan, of Chile, and probably other countries that I'm not aware of for the moment. It's my greatest pleasure, and I feel very much honored to be here, invited to give the opening speech on, as you can see, measuring democracy in times of transformation, an insight into the Bertelsmann Transformation Index. And as you can see from the map, what we are doing at the BTI is we try to assess the level of democracy, the level of market economy, and the level of governmental management performance in all the countries that are colored not in gray. So the classic transformation countries, which means excluded is Northern America, excluded is Western Europe, and as you can see, Australia, Japan, these countries are included, but otherwise we have at the moment 129 countries under our focus and our analysis. And I will concentrate today, of course, on the Middle East and Northern African region, MENA, because that's my own responsibility as the regional coordinator. And I want to, in maybe contrast to what you expect, not give an opening speech in a way which is nice and cozy and everybody feels well. Now, I have to say I feel a bit uncomfortable. I want to confront you with 3 problems and discuss it with you, and maybe we find a way out of the dilemma, or at least that we get sensibilized for the problems that people who try to measure democracy face in their daily work. The first problem that we have in the next BTI, which is supposed to be published at the end of this year, And where we collect all the data right now is Algeria is a democracy. This is something nobody has really witnessed. I was surprised myself when we collected all the data. Algeria is among those countries that we will highly probably count as a democracy from the next BTI on. So it was an autocracy, it has improved to a democracy, and I want to show you why. First, what is a democracy in the understanding of the BTI? We have in total 19 criteria for measuring democracy, but only these are really crucial to make a difference between an autocracy and a democracy. Which means we have selected these criteria, especially free and fair elections, which is, let's say, the entrance gate, the basic distinguishing criteria between an autocracy. And as you can see, if a country is ranked less than a 6 in the field of free and fair election, then it's an autocracy. Is it better than 6 or equal 6, then it qualifies for a democracy. The range is from 1, very bad, to 10, very good. And 6 is the threshold for this first criteria. The second is the question, are the political institutions also effective in their governance, which means if there's an elected parliament, for example, does the parliament have a say in the political process? If not, then it's not a democracy. Here the threshold is lower, minimum 3 to qualify for a democracy. The same applies for the questions association and assembly rights. Also minimum 3, otherwise it disqualifies as an autocracy. Freedom of expression, media freedom, personal opinion freedom, also minimum 3, otherwise it disqualifies. The separation of powers, checks and balances among the political institutions, minimum 3, otherwise it disqualifies. Finally, the question civil rights, sufficiently respected by the authorities, if not less than 3, autocracy. And an additional factor, in a failed state, we assume that democracy cannot work. So if a country with 2 questions, namely the monopoly on the use of force and the basic administration divided by 2, if it's then worse than 3, it will be also automatically an autocracy. That's important for the first beginning. So these are the conditions, and Algeria in the next BTI will probably score with these scores. And the problematic factor, as you can see, first, it fulfills all the basic requirements. Crucial is the very first indicator. Because here Algeria in the last BTI had a 4, so it disqualified for democracy. Now it has been improved because they had an election law reform in response to the Arab Spring. They had elections in 2012, which were created much better than the elections before, so we have to lift up Algeria to a 6. And then you see with this indicator, Algeria makes the jump from being an autocracy to a democracy. Before you note down all the data, these are preliminary data. These are the data I will show you later on, where the first country expert, the second country expert have given their recommendation, and I, as the regional coordinator, decide based on the impressions of the 2 experts, plus my own impressions, plus what the text says, what the indicator should be. But it's not the final indicator. Just next weekend we will have a 3-day conference in Frankfurt with all the other regional coordinators, and there we will have 3 days to check free and fair elections in Algeria in relation to free and fair elections in Brazil, or in Taiwan, or in Kazakhstan, or in all the other countries that we have in our portfolio, because I, as the regional coordinator for a MENA region, of course can only check what's going on in my region, but I do not really follow what's going on in the rest of the world. So it might be the case that the indicators will change, and you see, if we would say 6 is too good, it should be a 5. To be fair, in the international comparison, Algeria would again disqualify as a democracy. But I can show you the text for this. I'm convinced it should be 6. Just this indicator. What does free and fair election means in our understanding? We asked to what extent are political representatives determined by general, free and fair elections. And to the country experts who write and review the assessment for each of our countries, we give a clear questionnaire with pre-definitions. Let's say there are no constraints on free and fair elections. If that is the case in the country should be ranked 10 full points. Or if the authors, the reviewers have the impression it's a little bit less, then it should be a 9. Another pre-definition: general multi-party elections are held, conducted properly and accepted as a means of filling political posts. However, there are some constraints on the fairness of
Okay, we're back. And as you can see from the program, what we do now is we take the second part of the panel called the Arab Spring Theoretical Perspectives. I have a panel here consisting of 3 distinguished scholars. Bertolt Schweitzer from European Peace University in Austria, Said Edat from the School of International Politics and Political Science here at the University of Jordan, and Dr. Hassan Barali from the same school. So we're a little late, and what we'll do is we'll take half of coffee break, so we'll carry on for 1 hour and 45 minutes, and each panelist will have 20 minutes for a presentation, leaving us with something like 40 minutes for discussion. Let me introduce the panelists a little bit more. Bertolt Schweitzer, sitting far left, is Professor of Philosophy from European Peace University, Steining, Austria.
That's very difficult.
Yeah, it is. And that's Castle Steining, by the way. Okay. So that's where we're housed.
Bertolt has lived and worked in Cairo, has published in a large number of academic fields, among them the Middle East. His presentation here, Modeling Mechanisms of Transition in the Arab Spring, will critically examine the fruitfulness of modeling democratic transition for the examples of Egypt and Tunisia using causal social mechanisms. We have, on my right, who is Dean of the School of International Studies and Political Science here at this wonderful university. Dr. Said Edat has published on issues like the Arab Peace Initiative, foreign policy and political violence, and Islam and democracy. He is in a few months publishing a book, Belgrade, together with myself. Forgive me for this commercial thing here. His presentation is called Transition Mapping Theoretical Paradigms. And last but not least, certainly, Dr. Hassan Barali was published widely on Israel-Palestine, but has also focused his research on Lebanon and Jordan. His presentation here is called The Continuation of Autocracy in the Region. But I'll start by giving the floor to Bertolt Schweitzer. Please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. Let's see how we can manage this microphone. Switch on, very well. So, Excellencies, colleagues, students, guests, I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me. I think it's a good sign for interdisciplinary collaboration, for having a philosopher sort of step out of the ivory tower they're supposed to live in and actually talk to scientists, social scientists, political scientists, and so on. And I'd like to, here we go, so let's hope the presentation works. I'd like to present some ideas on the role of mechanisms and causal mechanismic thinking in social science in general, and when thinking about democratic transition in the Arab world in particular. So, a few basics on the mechanism-focused approach. It focuses on causal mechanisms. On what exactly a mechanism is, we'll learn more about very soon. Increasingly used in social sciences, the way I see that. And the hallmarks are basically the identification of causal chains and nexuses. In the other talk by Dr. Martin, we already had the concept of intervening variables, and this approach, yeah, I'm happy to see that this connects well with that, with the earlier talk, sort of picks up on this and extends this, expands this. And the main point is that these causal chains and nexuses, what we'd like to see as scientists, at least more often than not, is recurrent patterns. Yeah? So not something that's just unique, it's something that just occurs once, but something that we can identify in different contexts, but working in roughly the same way. Yeah? Of course, there are also like unique and contingent events, and it's a matter of debate whether we could call a genuinely unique event, yeah, to say it's based on a particular mechanism. I'd say, why not? Yeah? But usually, mechanisms are understood as something that you can find in a couple of different places, and of course, you can use the usual procedures of comparison and so on. So, of course, what's also involved is the determination of these mechanisms' initial conditions and outcomes. And I will discuss mechanisms in the social science here from mainly an epistemological and a methodological perspective. Okay, why are mechanisms important in the context of transition? Both democratic transition or other forms of transition, economic, for instance. The answer is simple, because we as social scientists, I'd argue, do not only want to describe states of affairs or changes, but we also want to identify the factors, the causes, what's responsible for that kind of change, and the connections responsible for, well, states where nothing changes and changes. Yeah? So, all in all, this is one approach that connects well with the ideas of, one could say, the founding father of sociology, Auguste Comte. Said the main goal is savoir pour prévoir, prévoir pour prévenir. So to know, to foresee, and to foresee, to prevent, or to act more generally. So you might ask, okay, what's my motivation behind this? Being a philosopher of science, yeah, I was. On the one hand, wearing my philosopher of social science hat. On the other hand, I wore that hat in Egypt too. I lived there during the revolution, not as a, one could say, participant observer, but somehow from the sideline, at least from very close. And I wondered, asked myself the question, well, in Egypt up to the morning of Friday, January 28th, virtually everyone, both in Egypt and abroad, thought that Mubarak's regime would never fall, at least not in the foreseeable future. Okay, 18 days later, he was gone. And I asked myself, why? And why was no one even remotely able to predict such an event? Okay, now let's talk about mechanisms. What's the definition? If you study the literature, you find any number of different definitions, some better, some worse. I like to follow two authors, Mario Bungi and Renata Mainz, and say mechanism statements. Yeah, let's talk about statements. Descriptions of mechanisms are causal generalizations about recurrent processes. Yeah, just mentioned that we're mainly interested in recurrent processes. If they happen not to be recurrent, I wouldn't include them, but that's what we're mainly after. Now, the specification of causal chains is what distinguishes propositions about mechanisms from propositions about correlations, for instance, something that most of us are probably used to using. it tries to go beyond that, beyond mere correlations, and identify what actually is responsible for this correlation being there. It also serves, of course, the purpose of distinguishing spurious correlations, yeah, that are just like random effects from genuine ones. Yeah? If you can identify a mechanism that connects the two sort of variables in the correlation, you have much more information than if you have the correlation alone. The term mechanism, of course, should be reserved for processes that involve a number of linked activities, several events or units. So if we just have like two elements, two variables that are immediately causally connected, it probably makes no sense to talk of a mechanism. Yeah? It only starts to make sense if you have more complex chains and networks. And the formulation of a mechanism may, of course, include or exclude initial conditions and outcomes. Yeah? You might say the initial conditions and the outcomes are all part of a mechanism, or you could say that the mechanism is just whatever connects these two variables. Okay. Now, the questions I'm trying to ask, and partially answer here, are what are the causes of revolutions and transitions in general, in what patterns, what is stable and recurrent in these patterns, and what's unique and contingent. And if we speak about transition, we usually assume that something is changing, yeah? That something is going from one state to another, for instance, towards either more or less authoritarianism or democracy. Yeah? It's clear that we can have processes and mechanisms both of democratization and de-democratization. So the question is, which mechanisms are working towards change? Which ones impede change? Which ones lead to stasis or persistence? So, now let's look at possible strategies for the analysis of mechanisms. In other words, what exactly is in the toolkit here to understand mechanisms? So, I'm going to say a few words about each of these points. Let's start with composition, environment, and structure. That should be fairly obvious, that we need to know something about what are actually the components. Yeah? What's the composition of the system or the collection of parts. We need to know something about the environment. That's a question that cropped up earlier this morning. One would look more closely at the environment and its influences on processes of transition. And of course, the structure, that is, the connections between the elements, the set of bonds or couplings between system components, but also the things in the environment that influence particular components of the system. One rather famous diagram illustrating the idea of mechanisms is this here, so-called Coleman's boat, James Coleman. Probably most of you will recognize immediately what this is about one famous hypothesis by Max Weber, the idea that Protestantism causes capitalism, yeah, to say it as briefly as possible. Yeah? And you might identify that. You might collect data about different states and the religious attitudes prevalent in these states, but then, as a next step, I'd argue, you will, or you should, ask, well, okay, but why? Yeah, what's causing this connection? Yeah, and the explanation presented here is that the Protestant religious doctrine, on the macro level, causes something on a either lower or more micro level in terms of values of individuals, which in turn influence economic behavior of individuals, yeah, again on the micro level, which then again sort of transforms into some effect on the macro level that we call capitalism. So that's one typical approach. Something else too that's important about mechanisms is that we have different stages in which we develop the understanding of mechanisms. Okay, and what we'd like to have as scientists is usually what's being called a schema instantiation. That is, we know the mechanism, we know how things hang together, and we can precisely identify the objects, the components of the system. But what we start with usually is some rough idea or some general sketch of how a mechanism works, and then gradually refine that. Yeah? It's sort of a top-down approach. You could also start with modular subassembly and say information about components and how they work, for instance, individual psychology, and based on that, try to conjecture how these modules or single parts would work together. We can also try forward tracking, that is, from some initial condition functioning as a cause, we try to determine effects, yeah? Or backward chaining, where we look at an outcome, yeah, that's something rather frequently tried. We look at the effect and try to identify the associated causes. So, okay, this is more about approaching mechanisms, refining mechanisms. We usually start with some sketch, but a sketch is incomplete. Many essential elements or entities and activities are missing. If we can, we should, okay, if we have nothing else, we should be honest. Yeah, my impression is that many descriptions of mechanisms are in this stage of a sketch. However, what we should try, if possible at all, is to develop these into some mechanism schema, which includes all essential elements, which is still a truncated abstract description, and even better, try to develop some instantiation of a mechanism schema, which is filled with descriptions of the known component parts and activities, and this is what can actually explain some outcome. Again, we might not always easily get that, but we should be honest where exactly on these, in these stages we are. Okay. You may also ask how exactly do we do that. Of course, we use the usual comparative methods. Something I'm not going to dive deeper into is a novel methodological approach called process tracing, which basically offers the idea that given a thick enough narrative, we can also use this to identify causal connections in a single case. Challenging, interesting, but I'm not going to dive into this here. Okay, so something about general patterns of mechanisms. We have, of course, things like feedback loops, both positive and negative. We have threshold mechanisms, oscillating mechanisms, the already described macro-micro mechanisms. Again, as a typology, a bit more about the Coleman's mode. We have what could be described as situational mechanisms, so influences of the environment or the situation on, could be individuals, but could be anything on a lower level, on a more micro level than the initial one. Action-forming mechanisms, transformational mechanisms. That's one offer of a typology. We could also look at some other typology offered by the late Charles Tilly, who distinguishes, again, environmental mechanisms, sounds similar to the situational mechanisms, but also relational mechanisms that alter connections between people's groups and networks, and cognitive mechanisms that alter individual and collective perception. Again, two different, not totally congruent typologies. So the question is, what can we do with that? How can we use that to analyze problems in democratic transition? We have a few of the usual suspects, some commonly acknowledged factors favoring democratization. I'll cut that short. Charles Tilly actually offers a description of mechanisms promoting democratization. Yeah, so I'll very, very briefly try to show you what he has in mind. Interestingly enough, he treats this as a universal rule, almost a law. Yeah, when he says the fundamental processes promoting democratization in all times and places, in all times and places, consist of increasing integration of trust networks into public politics, increasing insulation of public politics from categorical inequality, and decreasing autonomy of major power centers from public politics. Yeah? Without going into all this, I've prepared a few slides with more details. I think you can identify quite a few things that are going on. He also offers a more comprehensive overview which starts with a shock, then introduces quite a number of change mechanisms that deal with the 3 points just mentioned. All of these: reduced inequality, reduced influence of trust networks, and insulation of inequalities from public politics play an important role in democratization. Again, we'll